and thrilled to be here with you on this inaugural episode, the first episode of Tom Jordan Live. And it happens to come the day after the second assassination attempt of Donald Trump in just a 2 month period. So he's fine. The would be shooter never got off a shot after he put his AK-47 style rifle through that chain link fence, aimed it at Trump, who was about 300 yards away. Pretty easy shot with a scope, and Secret Service saw him. They shot at the suspect. The suspect fled and was arrested a short time later, thankfully. And it is appropriate that today we're going to talk about the news media in general. In a few moments, I'll be joined by Margo Cleveland. She's an investigative journalist with the Federalist. She is an attorney as well, and it's appropriate because, as is typical fashion for probably the strangest group of journalists in the world, the US media, in large part, downplayed again what happened yesterday. In fact, MSNBC engaged in what I would call victim shaming. They actually blamed Donald Trump for someone trying to take him out again. Why do they blame him? Well, it was his rhetoric, they say. They say he needs to tone it down. In other words, he deserved it, in a sense, is what they were implying there. It's kind of his fault. His rhetoric is too evil and whatnot. The Associated Press this morning put out a very long piece trying to figure out why this would happen again. They said that Donald Trump he's just kind of unlike most other candidates, and that he's very active in his community. And they even put out examples like specific to his locations on golf courses and where he goes to lunch and things of that nature, who he kind of mingles with within his club and where he does it. In other words, it's so easy to spot him that he kind of put himself in danger, and no wonder it's easy to take him out. This is the news media of today. And also, by the way, after the media continues to insinuate, as we saw in the ABC News debate, which we will get into in a moment, that Donald Trump is all of these horrible things, that he's racist, that he is a threat to democracy, that he spurs violent attacks, that he is an authoritarian who wants to overthrow the government and take over this country and get people to bow down to his will. That's the constant messaging of the narrative that seems to be coming out of this current modern day US state media. And all of that is based on fear mongering. It's not fact, it's not true. In fact, most of that is just the opposite of an objective view of Donald Trump and his policies. He's no saint. We're not saying that. He does believe in individual liberty, he does believe in the US Constitution. How many times do you think the media and the Democratic political elite currently in power, how many times have they framed Donald Trump as a threat to this country? And by extension, they say so are his Republican followers, only to be followed by a variety of attack against him and against Republicans. I mean, I talked with Congressman Mike Bishop the day that he was shot at, along with Steve Scalise and others in the Republican Party, by a deranged, hate-filled individual, a Democrat whose goal was to kill Republicans. Remember that congressional baseball game and the practice back in 2017? I spoke to Mike Rogers the day before. He goes, we're constantly being attacked and mischaracterized by who we are. Maxine Waters, Congresswoman out of California, she told Democrats and her followers to get into the faces of Republicans and tell them they're not welcome. Shout them down. And guess what happened after that? That's exactly what they did. They followed her orders, essentially. And then when Joe Biden, our president, stood in front of an ominous red wall to claim that Republicans were the gravest threat facing this country, guess what happened? Several Republicans were shot, they were run over by vehicles and killed, they were pummeled by this one guy, a radical leftist, followed by an innumerable number of buildings that were firebombed, vandalized with threatening messages. There was a woman in Michigan, and she was simply canvassing door to door, asking people to support pro life legislation. She was in her 80s, an elderly woman, and she was shot in the back as she was at the front door of this home in Michigan. There was a teenager, I think it was Minnesota, maybe Wisconsin, 18 years old. A man found out that he was a Republican after Joe Biden's speech, got into his car and ran him over because he was afraid of that 18-year-old Republican. Marco Rubio's assistant was nearly killed, nearly bludgeoned to death. It goes on and on. Donald Trump gets shot in Butler, Pennsylvania. And the media completely ignores it just 2 months later. It wasn't even mentioned, brought up during the ABC News presidential debate. Instead, they continued down the rabbit hole of saying that Donald Trump is somehow leading the violent charge against democracy. And then they wonder why he keeps getting attacked. Yesterday, 4 hours after this would be assassin was arrested, most media outlets had maybe a blurb on this. I saw CBS News, the website, with one piddly little story. Local newspapers like the Detroit Free Press, you had to scroll probably 20 stories down or so to find anything on this. So, why am I bringing this up now? Because, in my view, it's something we have to talk about and have to address this extreme hatred of Donald Trump by reporters, by journalists, has led to such a mischaracterization of conservatives to the point where their lives are regularly being put at risk while claiming the exact opposite is true. Um, or that's what's occurring. That Republicans are the one putting people's lives at risk. I was planning to start this first show in a much different way, but I will say this. Not only am I thrilled to be launching this new program with you, I think it's necessary. And you might think, well, Tom, it's not necessary that you do a podcast. And you'd be right. But that's not what I mean. What I mean when I say it's necessary, what I mean is that I think it's necessary that we continue to have open dialogue in this country. And I want to spend a few moments before I get to my guest, Margot Cleveland, with the Federalist, on this first episode of Tom Jordan Live, to discuss the importance and necessity of dialogue, both cordial and even confrontational. Agreements and disagreements should both be welcome in a free society. This to me isn't politics. Like people ask me frequently why I enjoy talking about politics so often, and the fact of the matter is I don't. I don't enjoy talking partisan politics. Politics is not the reason why we are doing this. In fact, I view most of the issues that have been deemed or categorized as political in nature as effectively, by their very nature, moral issues. These are ethical issues we are discussing, and they are intensely personal issues. In fact, the issues of the day have direct impacts on all of our lives, and depending on how they're approached and how they're handled, they will have either a negative or a positive consequence for somebody like you and somebody like me, just normal people. So, for example, when we discuss issues like the border, I don't look at that as a purely political issue. It didn't used to be looked that way either, as if we don't talk politics, so we shouldn't talk about the border. From somebody who grew up in a border city, I know full well the lack of a strong, effective border impacts my education, my kids, our health care, our cost of living, the crime rate, the unemployment rate, and more. And yes, I understand the need for true amnesty, for sure, true refuge for those who are truly fleeing maybe an active genocidal regime in a war-torn region, the way it was under, Soviet rule or Fidel Castro's Cuba, certainly under Hitler's Nazi Germany. That was genocide. And we should have stepped in more back then than we did. And that was shameful. But that's why it was heroic for Ronald Reagan to tell Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall in East Berlin. But what we are seeing right now, in large part, does not fall into that category, in my view. I mean, when Kamala Harris says that these are climate refugees and they are fleeing the climate, the media might want to do a fact check on that. Is that real? I mean, which climate are they fleeing to? A better climate? Is that refugee status? Other political issues you can look at. Look at the economy. That's pretty personal when you look at it. For those who believe in the free markets, that has a real-time, consequential, and personal impact on every American. There's a higher likelihood of prosperity in a competitive free market. But under a Democrat socialist approach with price controls and a taxpayer government subsidy driven economy, there comes a much higher probability not of prosperity, but of poverty on a much wider and, yes, equitable scale. Everyone can be poor and we'll all be poor together. It'll be equitable. So when socialism begins to lock its tentacles into our mindset and then into our institutions, and then it proliferates through academia and by extension throughout society, that touches every single American citizen. Political, yeah, it is, but also very personal, intensely personal, and it's an ethical and it's a moral issue. So name the political issue of the day. We could talk about abortion or what become has become known as gender affirming care and surgery for minors. Permanent sex change operations being encouraged without parental approval. The kind of car you're going to be allowed to drive, what you were told to inject into your own body by government mandate, or you might be fired. It's getting very personal, and that's why I feel this is necessary to continue to openly discuss these issues, despite this media landscape that has undoubtedly become beholden to kind of the new conventional wisdom, progressivism, and frankly, the growing dominance of a particular political party. And that, by the way, was a political party which I grew up in, and I left in my late teens because of some disagreements, mostly along economic and constitutional lines. But a party now that has been so radically transformed to such a degree that some of the biggest names of that party have fled it as well. My most recent and my now former place of employment was a place I thoroughly enjoyed working there, and I very much appreciated my colleagues. And despite some disagreements on our editorial approach, I genuinely cared and still do care about those individuals with whom I worked. We parted ways, and I'm fine with that. In the sense, I now have an opportunity to program on a platform in the way that I feel, and I believe a lot of people feel and see fit. Open dialogue, strong debate if needed, confrontation if needed, but always in a spirit of what's ultimately best for the individual citizen who was created in the image of God. My goal is that we learn together, and learning might come through disagreements and arguments, but that we do so in a respectful manner. But we also do so in such a way that we are not pressured or intimidated to not discuss certain issues based on a corporate mandate or political intimidation or advertising or partisan pressure to back down, or else that particular partisan might refuse to come back on the program. And it used to be that journalists and talk show hosts and news analysts were those who didn't care about those things. If you didn't want to come on our program, that was on you. It was your choice. It was not something that used to lead us to acquiesce to said candidate's demand or said politician's desire that we be more supportive of their positions, or else they're not coming back. So, with all of that said, I do believe that the reason we have God given rights, or that we recognize the natural rights given by God to every human being, is so that this unfortunate ability of we humans to fall to the worst angels of our nature, the darkness of humanity, that they will be held in check. They'll be held at bay, that this proclivity for those in power to obtain more power and then to abuse that power and authority to the detriment of others, to that we will not succumb. The First Amendment is a big part of that, to be able to speak freely and openly, even about things which others might vehemently and vociferously disagree with. It is a bedrock of this democratic republic in which we live, as is the freedom to practice your religion, and as is the freedom of the press. So, the freedom of the press, it is given in the Bill of Rights in order to combat a potentially growing power scheme amongst government officials or parties or any branch of government, and now particularly what seems to be a massive, powerful bureaucracy in this country. We all know this happens. We see it in other authoritarian regimes, countries like Russia and China and North Korea, Iran. Their news outlets are state run, state operated, and state funded and state directed. And some people call it propaganda. Accurate information is highly limited and restricted so that ultimately the people in those various countries and states will be deceived into believing falsehoods and lies. The United States is supposed to be different, but we do see a news media that has objectively succumbed to the corporate and political narrative that has been accepted and controlled by money, intimidation, indoctrination, and also threats of retribution. So if you've noticed a shift in how news is covered today versus 10, 20, or maybe 30 years ago, you're probably like most every other American, taking in this gobs of information via your streaming device or social media, your online rag, or maybe even your television. It's not just the Huffington Post or Breitbart anymore. It's not just Fox News like the left likes to claim. And it's not just MSNBC and CNN. It's the big three as well, the stalwarts of objectivity, CBS, NBC, and ABC, have seemed to become very useful tools of the progressive left. Like the most trusted news anchor in America nowadays, Lester Holt, is the same guy who said publicly that both sides are not equal and they don't deserve equal coverage. NBC is also said to believe they prefer not fair and balanced, but fair and right as they determine and who and what is right in their view, their truth, not necessarily yours. New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, you go down the list, they're all in on it, it seems. In on what, you ask? Well, it seems to me the sometimes subtle but sometimes overt effort to change American society, while at the same time claiming that they're protecting American values. So, in one breath, it's save democracy, and in another, it's we need to fundamentally change the foundational institutions of the United States, which, by the way, does away with the so called democracy they claim to cherish. So, in a few moments, we are going to speak with Margot Cleveland, an investigative journalist with the Federalist, to talk about the First Amendment, specifically the role and purpose of the press, the media, and the state of journalism, and what can be done to fix it, if anything. Is it too late, or is there some things we can do? But let me give you first some examples of how the media now works nowadays. The New York Times on August 31st, they published a piece that criticized Donald Trump by falsely claiming that Donald Trump wants to suspend the U.S. Constitution, including all its rules, all its regulations, and articles, which they would rightly claim is a danger if it was true, but it's not true. But they said it so ostensibly in defense of the U.S. Constitution. They say it's true. We need to watch out for Donald Trump. But later in that same New York Times piece, the author characterizes the Constitution itself as a danger to democracy because it allowed Donald Trump to ascend to the presidency. So, Constitution bad if it allows a conservative to become president, and the Constitution good if it doesn't. There's something amiss here. Furthermore, the New York Times admits that a growing number of liberals are in favor of radically changing the U.S. Constitution, and they frame it as an option to respectfully consider. Other examples, of course, would be the 2020 violent riots after the police killing of George Floyd. And what messages came through in those riots is a protest against the United States, essentially, under the guise of protecting minorities. It was widely praised by the likes of the New York Times and CBS News and the like as being mostly peaceful. And yet it destroyed many communities in which minorities live. They burned down minority owned businesses. They killed cops. They torched courthouses and police precincts. And many of the perpetrators of those violent crimes were bailed out of jail with the support of Kamala Harris and Hollywood and the political elites of the far left. The idea was let's burn down the institutions that were part of this country's founding and let's build back better. Build Back Better, this global initiative to fundamentally and foundationally change this country in order to be less objectionable to our foreign neighbors, the global elites who'd prefer that the United States to be, a wee less strong so they could be a lot more powerful. It's the equitable thing to do, they say. That's what Build Back Better means, by the way. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris subscribed to that ideology. They took that phrase from the World Economic Forum and then used it to campaign in 2020. So, why was and why is the news media seemingly engaged in that global objective? Do they not understand it, or do they simply believe that's what America should become? Maybe it's a bit of both, but there's little question the corporate media powers that be fully understand. So, how does this all play out? Well, sometimes it plays out in kind of subtle ways, shaping public opinion through carefully edited stories and craftily framed questions to build up a premise from which to ask one of those questions in a derogatory manner. So let's look at the debate last week, moderated by two liberal news anchors from ABC News, a network which a careful analysis, by the way, shows that its once respected World News Tonight newscast had 100% positive coverage for Kamala Harris and 93% negative coverage of Donald Trump. And that's not just the sound bites, but the comments given specifically by the ABC News reporters and the ABC News anchors. So last week's debate, ABC's David Muir decides to frame a question regarding tariffs on foreign imports, which Trump says is about, making them equal to what those countries charge the United States. But here's how David Muir asked the question.
Vice President Harris has argued it'll mean higher prices on gas, food, clothing, medication, arguing it costs the typical family nearly $4,000 a year. Do you believe Americans can afford higher prices because of
They're
tariffs?
not going to have higher prices. What's going to have and who's going to have higher prices is China.
Bass, I think, answered the question appropriately, but David Muir framed the question essentially from Kamala Harris. She said, this is what Kamala Harris believes, that it's going to raise prices, that it's going to cost Americans $4,000 more a year just because of your tariffs. Essentially, why would you do such a thing? Do you think that Americans can afford what you're asking them to do? But if you notice, if you heard the very beginning of there, I'm not sure we had that, but David Muir started it off with Kamala Harris says this. And then he built his question based on the premise that Kamala Harris says Donald Trump, it's a sales tax, a 20% sales tax, and that because of that sales tax, the cost of goods around this country are going to go up. Harris said it's going to raise costs. Do you believe it will raise costs? That would have been a better way to say it. Kamala Harris says this, Mr. President. Do you agree with her, and why or why not? That would have been the more objective way to ask the question. Instead, he took Kamala Harris's side and then, based on that premise, asked Donald Trump, why would he do that? Why didn't they ask Kamala Harris why she made that claim? They didn't ask her that. When tariffs are not only still in place, by the way, but Joe Biden and Kamala Harris wanted to raise tariffs. Why not challenge her claim? Because remember, Donald Trump has a track record on tariffs. He was widely criticized for proposing them back then. Democrats said tariffs would raise the cost of goods back when he was president. What happened instead? Billions of dollars of additional revenue came in, a return of American companies who had gone overseas were coming back to the United States. And those tariffs put China in its place. It was a good plan, but David Muir didn't want to talk about that. It's a subtle bias. I mean, I would say it's not so subtle, but that's how they do it. They frame questions based on a false premise. He did the same thing with January 6th, that Trump somehow led the march to attack the Capitol. That wasn't true, but nonetheless, the question followed by another question: do you believe you lost the election in 2020? And why do you keep switching your position on abortion? And David Muir even framed a question to Kamala Harris on the border with this line. Listen to this.
Vice President Harris, you were tasked by President Biden with getting to the root causes of migration from Central America. We know that illegal border crossings reached a record high in the Biden administration. This past June, President Biden imposed tough new asylum restrictions. We know the numbers since then have dropped significantly. But my question to you tonight is, why did the administration wait until 6 months before the election to act? And would you have done anything differently from President Biden on this?
If you notice there, what he said in there, that Joe Biden finally saw the problem. He finally got tough on the border and illegal immigration. It's dropped significantly under the Biden Harris administration. That's how he framed the question to her. So she's already been given, kind of handed this question. And yet there were an estimated 10 million illegal immigrants in 2020. Now there are at least 20 million, maybe 25 million or more. So it's likely more than doubled in the past 3.5 years. These are the moderators. These are their statements and their questions that are built on a false premise touted by Democrats, and which mischaracterize the facts in order to ask unnecessary questions to both Trump and Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, while ignoring a whole slew of critical policy issues like inflation and the economy and the current national security crisis with real threats from China and Iran and even Al Qaeda and ISIS, possibly within the United States right now. That wasn't brought up. The potential impacts of price controls on groceries and the supply chain. I mean, the real reasons behind high tuition. And why is the federal government even involved in the student loan industry anyway? What are the risks of single payer healthcare insurance to the actual quality of private healthcare system? And why do prescriptions keep going up in price, even while we are being told by Kamala Harris that they're actually going down? Did you know that? By the way, Medicare premiums are going through the roof. Did you know that? Kamala Harris says healthcare costs are less now, thanks to her and Joe Biden, but the exact opposite is true. Now, why do older Americans have 21% higher premiums this year than last? It's 50%, 57% higher in California, by the way, Kamala Harris' state. Why are premiums expected to increase next year by at least 50%? What will those candidates do with Social Security and Medicare, which will likely become insolvent within a few years if no one intervenes. Those things aren't being addressed. Nope, it's just, silly accusations from a leftist perspective, from what was a couple decades ago a respected news outlet. But again, why does this happen? Who is controlling all of this? Why are they all seemingly in sync? Well, George Soros is one of them. He's one of the largest stakeholders in American media. In fact, he just purchased 40% of one of the largest media companies in the country, Odyssey, which used to be called CBS Radio. Has direct ties to more than 30 mainstream news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, CNN, ABC. Each one of those operations has employees, often high level employees, on the boards of George Soros funded media operations. 13 prominent operations of the 180 media organizations he has funded, just those 13 equals 332 million people each month that he reaches with his particular ideology, his worldview. So, what is his worldview? What's George Soros believe? Well, he believes fighting terrorism is terrorism itself. He's a main critic of American supremacy. The main obstacle to a just world order is the United States itself. He supports open borders, no borders, the removal of national boundaries and sovereignty and the rule of law and silly things like national identity and social cohesion. He supports attorneys general and district attorneys who allow for the early release of prisoners and getting rid of bail for violent offenders. Just, kind of let them go. Arrested, they're out the same day because we can't keep them in jail or in prison. No bail, just let them go. He supports legalizing drugs and doing away with voting requirements like IDs and signature verification. He supports progressive secretaries of state. If you've wondered why so many reporters sympathize with anti Semitic protests on college campuses now and why politicians give them more credence in their calls to end the state of Israel, George Soros is one major reason why. You got activist judges, judicial activism, George Soros. The media follows suit because he, in large part, owns much of the media. So that's in part why, after the debate, ABC News the next morning on Good Morning America, they were in a celebratory mode because Kamala Harris did so well. ABC's own George Stephanopoulos. George Stephanopoulos, the Bill Clinton chief advisor and the Democratic strategist turned news anchor, couldn't help but boast about the next morning, proclaiming Harris put Trump on defense. No kidding. That was the plan all along. We know that was the plan. Seemingly now there's evidence that from an ABC News whistleblower that they had helped Kamala Harris along the way here. Maybe a head start in this debate. The current vice president, Kamala Harris, was never pressed on her administration's failures. Never. You could look at Afghanistan, the border, inflation, none of it. Donald Trump pressed her, but why didn't the moderators? Because ABC wasn't interested in a fair discussion. They were seemingly too busy stacking the deck, as Chris Christie admitted after the debate, protecting Kamala Harris from scrutiny while letting her attack Donald Trump with impunity. Margot Cleveland is our guest this morning. She's on the inaugural episode here of Tom Jordan Live. I believe we have her now. We got her right now, Caleb and Cameron? We do. There she is. Margot, it's so good to have you back on the program. Margo Cleveland, if you don't know, she is an attorney. She's the chief investigative reporter and legal correspondent for the Federalist, a publication I read on a regular basis, and it's just great stuff. Margo, it's good to have you. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks so much, Tom.
So I know I want to talk a little bit about this because I know the Federalist has just asked ABC News, the network, if they would disclose their debate as kind of an in-kind contribution, donation to the Kamala Harris campaign. Obviously, ABC News didn't respond to this, but it seems to me like kind of a legitimate question if you see what they did during that debate and how it seemingly favored Kamala Harris.
Well, really, all the media should be doing that if anyone does. If you watched any of the Sunday shows yesterday, you saw the exact same thing happening with JD Vance. Vance called them on it, which was great, but it was pathetic. It was so one-sided, and you're seeing the type of attack that you would see from someone they should be debating as opposed to asking questions for. And it is prevalent at every media outlet. And it's not just the way they question, it's the topics they question on. And then for the Democrats, the topics they don't question on. So I think with the debate, what you saw was really such a great example with the fact checking, that they fact checked Trump, but they fact checked him wrong. And one of the things that I think is just a perfect example is where after Trump made the comment that Harris supported transgender surgeries paid by taxpayer dollars for prisoners, you saw the media fact check saying, oh, that's false. They don't even know the truth themselves because they're in an echo chamber. And that's a huge problem that they only have knowledge of half of America. And I think George Soros, the funding, obviously, that's part of the problem. But I think part of the problem is that they don't talk to people who have differing viewpoints, and they don't understand the differing viewpoints.
Well, I want to bring that up because to me that's a main issue here. It's like they don't consider that anymore as a legitimate ideology or a legitimate viewpoint. And you're right that the checks that they had during this debate were incorrect. And I remember Donald Trump brought up the issue of, well, actually, David Muir brought it up again. They keep saying Donald Trump keeps talking about the stolen election, but the media keeps asking him about it. So they brought up 2020. He says, why do you feel you lost? He goes, no, I think I still won that. I think there was fraud. And then David Muir pipes in and says, well, that's all been adjudicated by 60 different judges. So we know that's not true. And Donald Trump says, no, the evidence was never allowed. They didn't allow the presentation of the evidence. So it's never been adjudicated. It's never really gone to a full scale trial nor an investigation on this. So the fact checks were incorrect. But when you bring up the idea that like David Muir and Lindsay Davis, they're just two of so many, I would say probably 90% of the journalists in this country share that ideology. But why are they in this bubble in the first place? Like I pictured David Muir running back to his newsroom with Lindsay Davis, almost hand in hand, arm in arm, skipping and going back to the newsroom to a round of applause because they attacked Donald Trump and let Kamala Harris skate. Why does that ideology and that why does that bubble exist in the first place, do you think?
Well, I think that it comes from the nature of journalism that it usually the people who make it up to that level, they go through the top J schools,
Hmm.
and academia is very left leaning. So that's where you're going to get that kind of perspective taught to you. And then you have to look at who's going to make it up the career level. It's not going to be the people who destroyed Biden in the debate. It's going to be the people who give them the pass on it. So I think that that's part of it. Um, it's hard to tell if there is more to it than that. Maybe it's just who the journalism profession attracts in general.
Well, I think it attracts activists. In fact, I've spoken to a number of J schools, at different times in my career, and some of them sometimes it very much surprised me. I had gone to one classroom, and I asked the question, "Why do you want to be a journalist?" And oftentimes I hear the response of, "Because I want to change the world." And I'll say, well, that's not your job as a journalist. What you want to be is either an activist or you want to be a politician. You don't want to be a journalist. But they said, no, I want to be a journalist because that's what they do. Another person said to me, well, I want to be a journalist because she mentioned Donald Trump specifically because he wants to kill black people. And I said, okay, well, let's approach that with a journalistic, method. How would you? That's an incendiary claim that you're making. So how would you, as a journalist, approach that? If you knew that to be true, how would you go about writing that article? And we went through the process. She didn't have any information. There was no evidence. There's no data to support her claim. But that is the premise that's now been developed. And to me, that's one of the big concerns is that you're right. Academia is I think that progressivism, the far left ideology has infiltrated systemic in academia as we see it right now. And then they're launching these people out into the real world. And that's why maybe we see that. I think it's a very astute point you made. Not all, Hillsdale College, I spoke to their journalism students. They're very objective. They're like right down the middle. People say, oh, that's a conservative college. It is. But conservative is the opposite of extremism, right? Wouldn't you say that's the case? Like a conservative viewpoint means let's not be radical. Let's stick to the facts. Let's stick to the Constitution and the First Amendment, which of course gives us the right of the free press.
Right. And I also want to say that I think another huge problem that we're having is not at the top, it's at the bottom. That Americans no longer value free speech. And you see that because young adults, teenagers think that disinformation, misinformation, hate speech needs to be prohibited. And we can talk about it at the high level, but if we don't have ordinary Americans understanding why we need to have free speech, why we need Harris to be held to the same standards as Trump, it's not going to change. And I'm actually kind of amazed that COVID hadn't kind of shaken people awake because the danger of squashing free speech was on display there. Why do
Yes.
we need free speech? We need to get to the truth of the matter. And with COVID, we saw that not only did we not get to the truth, we had our government lying to us
Mhm.
and people making decisions based on it. So you would think that what we saw, a perfect case study of COVID, would wake people up that we need this free speech to get to the truth, whether it's about Ukraine, whether it's about the economy, whether about what is really a threat to democracy. So I think journalism needs to be shaken up, but I also think we need to get back to first principles and starting in, grade 1 that this is fundamental to a free society.
Yes, it is. And, we can go all through the educational system right now and what these kids are now being taught in grade one, which to me is just incredibly damaging to their psyche and their long term psychological health because they're being taught things that are absolutely not true and really against nature without their parental knowledge, which, of course, is another violation, I believe, of the Constitution. But that's happening. I mean, there's so many issues that are happening within our educational system. But I do think at the core of this is free speech and the whole First Amendment issue. We got free speech, we've got the freedom of the press in there. I think they're kind of hand in hand. It's very concerning to me. So when we're dealing with people who are calling disinformation a danger to democracy, what they're basically saying that misinformation or disinformation is something that is not true the way we see it. So I know in the state of Michigan, for example, there's the Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson and the Attorney General in the state, Dana Nessel. They're two very far left progressives, and they have put out a campaign and they're saying basically, if there's any, if you, and this is now the call to the citizens, if you see anyone or know anybody who is putting out misinformation or disinformation, which means something they believe is not true, it's not illegal, it's maybe even a lie. It's not true. But if it's disinformation in their view, you need to come to us and report them. This is how you do it. We'll put them on a list and we'll follow up. And then they further said to the media, we need your help in this campaign to filter out disinformation the way that we see it. Dana Nessel, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson on this strange campaign to root out different viewpoints than theirs. So that's an engagement right there with the news media. And they're putting out the call right in the state of Michigan. But I think by extension, there's others who are, in office in the same positions around the country who are doing the same thing. And the media, in your view, are you seeing that reporters and anchors are just going, absolutely, we'll comply, we'll root them out as well?
Well, you're seeing it at the national level in the legacy media. And again, you can go back to the debates and the Sunday show, the Sunday shows to see exactly this. And it's a perfect case study on when you have the media deciding that they're going to be the arbiters of truth, they're going to end up just hiding what the truth is.
Yes.
Consider what Trump said about abortion. So he used a rhetorical flair of that they're going to execute babies after birth.
Yes.
And the reality is that in many states, you can, if a baby is born alive in an abortion, is you can allow the baby to die even though if it was a baby that was born preterm and the parents wanted the baby, they would provide care to. And that's a reality. He also spoke about the fact that you can have abortion up to birth.
Hmm.
And afterwards, what happened? The media came out that I think it was 6 or 7 states, there's no limit. Michigan appallingly being one of those.
Hmm.
Like, "Oh, well, this doesn't happen." Yes, it
It
does
does.
happen. But again, this is where the media is doing the fact checking as part of it. They don't even necessarily call it misinformation, they just treat it as misinformation. You saw it when they were talking about the crime statistics that Trump was talking about, the crime is higher. And you're not getting to the truth when the media thinks it is their job. It is their job to provide information and evidence, not to put their finger on the scale of what it is. And it's really one of those things that the average person who isn't kind of a news junkie, I don't even think that they know. And I want to just share kind of this anecdote because I think it's
Yes.
very telling. I used to teach for years undergrad students at the University of Notre Dame. And one of the professors, who is 20 years older, and I became very close over the time. He's retired. He has Parkinson's now, and we still keep in touch. And he considers himself conservative, but he despises Trump. So we
Mm.
have these conversations, and because we respect each other, we can actually have good conversations. And he'll say stuff to me that is factually wrong. And he is getting this from the news. And I said, Tom, this isn't true. Let me tell you what the truth is. And I'll give him the sourcing. And he is legitimate, intelligent enough that he will go and actually read what I share and understand what I'm saying. So if you have someone who comes at it from a conservative perspective, who's I mean, he has a PhD, he's very intelligent, and yet he believes what's in the news because he's getting
Oftentimes,
a
yeah, oftentimes the people that you just described, your friend, a different Tom than me, I presume, but
yes,
Tom
a different
nonetheless is a
topic.
fantastic name. But I would suspect because I have conservative friends of mine who also hate Donald Trump, and I'll admit I was not initially a fan of Donald Trump. There are things about him that are very flawed, and we could admit that while also believing that I think his policies really have a personal impact on my life, on your life, and everybody's life. I have very liberal friends of mine who are now coming out and saying, okay, all those things we were told, I'm not seeing this to be the case. And one of those things is Joe Biden himself. And you could look at the things that he has done objectively and say, okay, those things are much more serious if they are true than anything that Donald Trump is accused of. And I want to bring up something that you wrote about recently in the Federalist. I want to read this just to make sure I got this correct. You recently wrote in the Federalist about not only the consequences of the media at large ignoring this damning report that came out from Congress regarding the impeachment, investigation and the inquiry into Joe Biden, but the fact that they have been ignoring this at large, it's deep corruption within the Biden family's incredibly lucrative influencing peddling scheme that they have likely been going on for years regarding energy corporations, governments, deals with often were struck while Joe Biden was vice president of the United States. And these are things that you can now look at on paper in black and white. You could read about these things. I've read about a lot, and you have because you've written a lot about this. But how revealing is this cover up of what may be, if all of this is true, likely the worst and most corrupt scandal this country has ever seen by a sitting president of the United States, and that would be Joe Biden, if it is true that he and his family reaped tens of millions of dollars from overseas entities, including from our foreign enemies, because of an influence peddling campaign. I mean, that to me, that's just the definition of corruption. You would think that news reporters and producers and publishers would be just salivating over a story like this, but they are not. What does that reveal to you?
Well, it reveals that they want to protect those who they believe have the same kind of goals and views for America. And all you have to do is contrast that to the Russia collusion hoax,
Yes.
where everything that was fake was presented as the truth. And it was and is an astonishing scandal of this Biden family corruption. But I would actually say there's a bigger scandal regarding Biden. It's that he is mentally incapacitated. We
Yes.
all saw it. And not just we all saw it, we had George Clooney and Obama saying basically he acted the same way at this other, fundraiser. And not only did the press and his people cover it up, the country's moved on. He's our commander in chief. Kamala Harris is the vice president. I think that's a an even huger scandal because that the corruption comes and goes. He's going to be out. The part that's more appalling is that it was covered up. The same with his incapacity, that Harris is letting him continue to supposedly be the commander in chief when he clearly doesn't have that capability. And yet the media has just kind of moved on like, okay, well, he's not really president, but we don't really care. So it really is on just so many levels appalling.
Well, yeah, it is appalling because they say, well, he's no longer going to be president, and they say the same thing about the COVID lockdowns, and I think the oppression of civil liberties in this country. Well, that was 4 years ago. Who cares? It's long gone. But they still continually bring up January 6, 2021, and they tie Donald Trump to this and this claim that he's the one that led a so-called insurrection, tried to overthrow the government, which of course is totally false. Even the FBI's initial investigations, no, these were a bunch of different individuals, different splinter groups that all kind of mixed together, and they attacked. It was a riot at the Capitol. So the initial investigations, which were more objective, it was a few months after, several months after it occurred. They came out that summer, I think 2021, and said, "Now this is not like a large orchestrated effort to attack the Capitol." But they still bring that up. And then they act like the current president right now. It doesn't matter. Do you believe, by the way, I wasn't planning to bring this up because we don't know, this has not been verified, but there's a lot more evidence out there that maybe that this is true, that there was an ABC News reporter ABC News person, I don't know, a reporter or whatnot, but a whistleblower essentially that came out and said this debate with David Muir and Lindsey Davis with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, that they had been colluding with Kamala Harris, meeting with the Kamala Harris campaign multiple times, excluding Donald Trump on this. To agree to certain terms in order for Kamala Harris to agree to this debate. And that included not bringing up Joe Biden's mental capacity and why she never acknowledged that. Do you think there's any teeth
Yeah,
to that
so
accusation?
my kind of gut is it wouldn't surprise me if it happened, but it seems that anyone who would know that would be privy to that kind of conversation wouldn't be a whistleblower. They're going to keep kind of a tight wrap around it. And
Mm.
I always kind of look at it, this is the left trying to set the right up that they, spin something
Yes.
that is going to kind of backfire on them. But whether they had the plot or not, they did do the fact checking only on Trump.
Yeah.
When Harris, she lied about the very fine people. That how can you get any more blatant? I when that line came out, she said that I'm like, okay, they're obviously going to fact check this, right?
Right.
Because that's something that even Snoops has, the
Right.
has
Snopes.
shown.
Yeah.
Snopes, thank
Yeah.
you, has shown is false.
But I
But
do think
they
Snoop
didn't.
does support Donald Trump, but that's another story. Snoop
Well,
Dogg.
I wasn't sure of that, but
Yeah.
that one is so blatantly false that you can't believe that they didn't do it. So I don't need the whistleblower to say this is what was going on. It was so clear to every American. Yeah, if it comes out, it supports it, but at this point, it's so blatant. I think that even average people who aren't political could see what was going on there.
Yeah, I think so. I want to bring this up because I think it just kind of speaks of how deep this leftist progressive ideology is in the news media. Mara Gay, do you know her? She's the New York Times editorial board member.
Sure.
She came out the other day and saying that she's very disturbed at the sight of dozens of American flags flying in Long Island, and her position is essentially that the United States is dangerous and it's unjust, and the United States is racist, and ironically, patriotic people who love this country are a danger to this country. But to that point, that belief, from Mara Gay and people at the New York Times, that the United States is inherently unjust. It is a racist country. It's got, it purposely is stacked against minorities in this country, and it's systemic. It needs to be essentially, if maybe figuratively, torn down to rebuild and to build back better. Do you think that ideology is really what's at play here within newsrooms across this country?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily that ideology, but that is consistent with the liberal ideology. So, and that is definitely filtering throughout all the newsrooms. What I think is the most ironic about that is the same people saying that are the ones saying unity. If it weren't for that Donald Trump, we would be united as a country. And that's the other part there. And like you, I actually was never Trump. And a lot of people don't know this. I did not vote for Trump in 2016. I was mocking people who did. And it's one of those things that in retrospect, I'm like, okay, I shouldn't have been doing that. I didn't understand the appeal. And then when he got in, he governed, like you said, his policies have done more for this country and more for people, including people who are in the lower class, including people of all races, that it showed me it's like, you know what? He is not a politician. He doesn't talk like politicians. He's a leader, and he has shown that. And I think that that ideology that you spoke of is probably prevalent because it is part of this kind of liberal ideology, but it's so bizarre that at the same time they're professing we need unity. You know what unity is? Unity is a united states, not as segments of it, but as a country that loves as a people that love the country that they're in.
Right. And I often get, say, hey, you guys just need to stop, involving yourself in this, the cultural issues, and just to kind of back off and just love one another and be quiet about these things. To me, are like the other side is not doing any of that. They're actually going full bore. I mean, as Governor Whitmer said, I think a couple years ago when they won the midterms, then Democrats took over the state of Michigan in both the House and the Senate and the legislature. She said, it's time now to step on the gas. We are going to go nonstop to get all these progressive ideas done in case we end up losing, power in a couple of years in those both houses of the Senate and the House in the legislature in Michigan. So to that end, it's like, okay, well, if we stop talking about it because you want us to be united around what? Around progressivism? And I often bring up, Woodrow Wilson way back in the early 20th century and his idea of progressivism. And he was one of the early kind of fathers of that movement, I would guess. But he didn't really, in my understanding of this, is he didn't really believe in this like separation of powers. He's one that really got the bureaucratic kind of state going to give some unelected bureaucrats more authority, and Congress gives that to them. Then they kind of make up these laws that we all have to abide by. And I don't think most Americans understand how consequential that was and how we're living under that slight bit of socialism that seems to be growing within this country. And I bring this up because we now have an effort to essentially overturn the Supreme Court in this country. And there's this effort, Justice Jackson, she talked about the First Amendment. You brought up free speech. She said that the First Amendment could really hamstring the government, especially during perceived threatening circumstances. So, in a sense, that the First Amendment needs to be curtailed or maybe even done away with that. And there was this article you've written about this, Murthy versus Missouri, this case where the government argued that it could communicate with social media companies about potential threats. This is why we see the government intervening with Facebook and what was then Twitter, trying to get them to take down information that they didn't like that maybe was critical of the government. And that is a threat. If you're critical to the government, that's a threat to the country. No, it's a threat to your power, in my view. But they looked at that as obviously potential threats to the country, and they can do that without violating the First Amendment. Can you kind of give us, okay, what really was going on in this case? What was the Supreme Court considering, and what was the government doing by intervening, particularly with social media news outlets?
Sure. So there's actually quite a few points in there that they all do tie together. If you look at what Whitmer was saying about we need this power, we're
Hmm.
seeing first off the same exact thing with Harris. What is their whole idea? Let's turn the page. They're sending it to Americans that we're going to turn the page from Donald Trump and we're going to get back to normal. But they want to turn the page so that they can radicalize the country by, as you said, rebuilding the Supreme Court. And that's one of the things they're going to rebuild the Supreme Court so that they can then get this kind of bureaucratic state taking over for the Supreme Court. And I actually wrote an article on this, I think it came out last week, where I said that the real threat to democracy is Harris, it's not Trump. And as the example I gave, they want to rebuild the Supreme Court.
Hmm.
And free speech was the second example I gave. She and Democrats, and as you said, Supreme Court justice right there, they see the First Amendment as hamstringing. Whereas what has Trump said? I'm going to come in and I'm going to get rid of all these people who were doing what happened in Murphy. So let's take a look at the Murphy case. And just so you know, I actually am of counsel at the New Civil Liberties Alliance. So I'm a lawyer for the organization that is representing several of the private plaintiffs in that case. So in that case, what was happening was that we had federal government officials in a lot of different agencies. So the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, the CDC, they weren't just making suggestions, they were pressuring and encouraging the censorship of speech that they didn't like. And again, COVID was such a perfect example because they were blocking out the idea that this came from a lab, which it did. And the evidence is now showing that the vaccines were safe, which we now are seeing that they're not, or they're not nearly as safe, or they definitely are not safe for certain people. The risk benefit maybe for other people. And that closing down the schools and requiring kids to wear masks was both scientifically valid and a good for society. So you have three different things that our government was directly telling social media companies this is fake. You need to take this down. You need to censor it. And they did this while wielding their authority of look, we have regulatory authority. You have this 230 protection so you can't be sued. We might need to rethink that. Frankly, from my perspective, none of that matters. Our government should never be telling third parties what speech to silence. This is a totally different scenario than you heard actually if you listen to the argument where Kavanaugh and I can't remember who else. They said, "Well, we always talk to the reporters. Oh, don't publish that." That's a different scenario. The New York Times can decide what it wants to publish, and if it decides against publishing something, you know what? The Wall Street Journal might publish it. The Federalist might publish it.
Yes.
But social media is the marketplace. This is the town square. And if our government tells them to shut people up, they're not silencing their own speech. They're silencing everyday American speech. And what the government realized when they started using social media, they used it to prompt foreign foreigners in their own countries to react certain ways. So they were using it basically as a psyops in foreign countries. And then they realized, hey, we can do this in America.
Absolutely.
And it is terrifying because they're using psyops on their own citizens.
Yeah, psychological warfare, which, by the way, is I think what George Stephanopoulos was praising Kamala Harris for doing in the debate against Donald Trump. So they're very versed in psyops
Yes.
and that kind of thing. It is. I wish we had more time. We can go on forever here. But you've written so many wonderful things in the Federalist, and I think you do incredible work, and it is one of the few areas where we can get, I think, a solid, evidence, data-driven, evidence-based journalism in the Federalist. So thanks for your time. Margot Cleveland is the investigative journalist and legal analyst, serves as the senior legal correspondent for the Federalist. Margot, so good to talk to you again. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much, Tom, and congrats on the new show.
Thank you. Appreciate it so much. You're the first guest. You're Margot Cleveland with the Federalist. Always a privilege to have her on. And I want to thank you all we're out of time already on this inaugural edition of Tom Jordan Live, but we'll be here every day. You can also, we'll be streaming this every morning, 9 a.m. Eastern Time on all the major platforms. You can find us on YouTube, Tom Jordan Live, Facebook, Tom Jordan Live will be on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, everywhere, Apple Podcast, you name it. I can't remember them all. They're all over the place. So check it out. Thank you for your time. Go to tomjordanlive.com if you want further information, how you can be a part of the program. Also Patreon, Tom Jordan Live /Patreon, however you find it there. We'd love your support in that vein as well. Until tomorrow, God bless you. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.